Hey, Intro to IR class. Black Panther here to give you a special lecture talking about the importance of foreign aid. This is Intro to IR 4.4, Foreign Aid. Okay, so this one should be quite different than lecture 4.3, which is talking about sanctions, which is very much about, to quote Thor, if we're doing an Avengers theme here, bringing the hammer down, right? We're going to be going a different way here, and we're going to be talking about the giving aspect. So that lecture was all about how we take money with economic statecraft. This is going to be how we give money through economic statecraft, okay? So foreign aid. Foreign aid is aid that is given by one country, we call this the donor country, to another country, we call this the recipient country, okay? Donor and recipient. And this can be for a lot of different reasons: health, economic development, poverty relief, etc. There are four main types of aid. Four main types, and we're going to walk through all four of them during this lecture, okay? So the four, just to highlight for you here: development aid, military aid, democracy aid, humanitarian aid. Okay, those are the four. We're going to take this lecture and go through all four of these. So let's start here. I'm going to pop up this figure for you guys to look at. Foreign aid, the big picture. Aid is a big business. There are multiple countries, non-state actors, individuals that all have a lot at stake here when it comes to the business of aid, the business of foreign aid. So what you can see here, the green bars here on the left are looking at the top 10 donor countries. This is, I should say, this is 2017 data. So it's a little outdated, but it can be tough to have like perfect data ready to go for something like 2019. They're currently collating that and trying to put together these cool infographics for us. So this is 2017 data. Top 10 donor countries, they're probably the ones you expect, 1, 2, and 3 being the USA, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Top 10 recipient countries then, the top 3 for 2017, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Okay? So there are a couple of things that you can look at for this infographic. The bottom left corner, it's talking about foreign aid over time, so that you can see that while there was a dip in the mid-1990s, it has been continuing to increase over time, that this has become a bigger and bigger and bigger business. And I think what's really important here to look at, and that's what we're going to break down during this lecture, the bottom of it, where you see kind of that pie chart looking thing, the distribution of aid by sector. So here you can really look at and see, where does the money go? What type of projects, what type of aid is being sent? So we have everything from social infrastructure and services, economic infrastructure and services, humanitarian aid, multi-sector, production sector, unspecified, right? We'll talk about that as well. But just so that you can understand the different types of aid and the makeup of that aid and how much aid is given, okay? So in the map, you can obviously see the darker red you get, the more aid you're receiving. The darker green you get, the more aid you are giving, all right? So let's start here with the first one, development aid. Development aid is aid given to a country to help develop its economy. Development aid is by and large the most common form of aid. Goals with development aid are things like eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, lessen human suffering, reducing political instability, promoting economic growth. And I have here on this slide, if you're checking out the slide, aid is ideally, right, quote unquote, ideally given based on demonstrated need. So here, what's supposed to be happening are all of these different measurement tools that we could use, something like Fragile States Index or something like Human Development Index. The countries that rank at the bottom of all these different indexes of showing, I have the clearest demonstrable need, I should be getting the money. That's the ideal situation. However, we know that is not always the case. So I have a couple of other things here that will walk through other factors determining whether or not you will get development aid. So, what is your security interest to me? What is your strategic value to me? Right? Think through our different theories we've been talking about and imagine what type of theoretical perspective this is. What is your strategic, military, geographic interest to me, right? Very realist, all right? So something like Syria and Cuba getting aid, they are of strategic military importance, okay? They are strategic geographically. There are security threats in these countries that we have a vested interest in controlling or dissipating as the US government. So that will determine aid. Also, number 2 is a really important one. Colonial history of donor to recipient. So overwhelmingly, France only provides aid to its former colonies. If you are not a former French colony, you're not going to get aid because they're too invested in giving the I'm sorry money to their colonies. Somewhat similar to the UK. The UK has branched out a bit more in terms of where they give aid, but a bit similar following that same lines of depending on what your colonial history is, you can determine whether or not you will be likely to get money from that source. Okay. Number 3 then, whether a state is democratic or not. So again, we can go back to something like the sanctions slide. If you are not democratic, you're more likely to get sanctions hit against you. Often we'll use sanctions as a way to push you to become democratic. Same thing here with development aid. You're more likely to get it if you are democratic, even if it's just an ish, democratic-ish. You're more likely to get it than some type of locked down authoritarian regime or a locked down authoritarian monarchy, something like that. The 4th one then, this is again building off this idea of are you like us in the sense of promoting and encouraging liberal economic policies? Do you trade openly with other states? Even if you don't have that much to give, because when it comes to development aid, what you're saying is, I need help. I need a kickstart. I need a boost. I need investment. I need support. So it may be that I don't have a lot to trade at this point, but I'm very open to trade. I would love to trade the way that you trade, as long as you have that personality. That matters too. So you can see all of these different things here can impact not just are you the most in need of aid. Ideally, that's what should matter, but we live in a realist world and we understand that's not always what happens. Okay? These other factors can impact whether or not you get aid. So I'm going to pop up table 9-1 from the book here. This is top aid donors by actual amount and as a percentage of GDP. This is interesting. So again, a little dated. This is 2015 data, but so you can see the amount of aid in millions of dollars, but then more importantly, understanding it as a percentage of GDP. So the US topped the list from the previous map slide of giving the most money, but we actually do not give much in terms of a percentage of our GDP. It's only about like 15 to 20, 0.15 to 0.20% of our actual GDP is given in aid. It's still a heck of a lot of money. But if you compare something like Sweden that gives almost 1.5% of their GDP to foreign aid, there is a difference here. So we give way more money. It's not as big a chunk for us compared to other countries. Just different ways to be thinking about it and looking at it. So let's start and talk about number 2 here, military aid. So military aid is aid given to a country that directly enhances its military capability. So there's a couple of ways that this could go. It could go the way of funding. So we will provide funding that we have specifically earmarked for you to use to buy military equipment, to aid in your recruiting initiatives, to aid in training. It could be that it's the gift of military equipment, the gift of. So it's not, here's some money, go buy your own. It could be, here is a plane load full of missiles. take them, okay? Things like grants, low interest loans, these can also be forms of military aid, and something like peacekeeping operations in and of themselves. You might not be in a position to keep the peace in your own country, so we will send boots on the ground to do it for you. That can be seen as a form of military aid. We are helping you, supporting your military through additional boots on the ground to help you calm this situation, okay? Military aid is very beneficial to both parties, donor and recipient. So the recipient obviously gets enhanced military capabilities. Donors, in particular countries like the US and Russia, they get business for their arms industries. These are very lucrative deals for US businesses because we are the largest producer and seller of arms in the world. So we are, by nature, the largest provider of military aid to countries. So again, if we think of determinants of aid, who's going to get this? Obviously, strategic value of the country in need. That matters to us. Human rights record. Again, we go back to this idea of we're not going to give you these weapons if we think you're going to use them against your own people. Regime type builds into that, obviously. There are some challenges here, though, that this has not always gone well for us. So, for example, during the Cold War, when Afghanistan was fighting its war with then the Soviet Union, the U.S. gave frequent gifts of military equipment, often doing it anonymously because we didn't want to be seen as directly supporting the Mujahideen. So we would give anonymous gifts of military equipment to support the Mujahideen's efforts to expel the Soviet Union from Afghanistan. Flash forward 20 years and what happened? They used our gift against us and have waged war against us with those weapons ever since. So it doesn't always go well. You can be arming your friend and then in a month turn out they're not your friend anymore. Let's take a pause here for a minute and we'll come back and talk about the other two forms of aid. So we will be right back together. Okay, I feel it was only appropriate to switch to Captain America because now we're talking about democracy aid. Okay, democracy aid. Aid given to a country to enhance and consolidate its transition to democracy. All right, I'm gonna lift this up because it's kind of silly. This is targeted aid, very targeted aid that has been popular since about the 1980s. And the goal here is to either help a country become more democratic or keep a country from slipping back into autocratic rule. Democracy aid can be very specific and targeted to do something like pay for the hosting of an election, hosting a free, fair election. It can be targeted to support other constitutional arrangements. So we need you to sit down and write a constitution. We will pay to make that happen. Building and empowering institutions. So in particular, what you'll notice here is we don't often give this money to promote something like an executive because we already fear that they'll find ways to get that money anyway. So we will instead do things like provide money to support legislatures, a free and fair and independent judiciary, bureaucracies, actually doing something like providing training to bureaucratic people within a government to teach them something like, hey, here's how you manage a budget. Hey, here's how you actually run this meeting. I've actually been a part of a research project in Malawi that for about 3 years they were running a pilot program. It was a consortium of a number of different NGOs that were involved. They were working at the ground level in Malawi attempting to do government trainings for what we call village development committees, VDCs. But the whole point was that all of these people can run for this office or be appointed to this position to serve on a VDC, which is the lowest level of governance in Malawi. But it's the sense to which, do you even know what a VDC is? Do you know that you should keep minutes? Do you know that you will have a budget and this is what your budget will look like, that you're supposed to be doing projects and this is how you monitor and track a project from start to finish, right? So it's this idea of, if you don't know what a VDC is, but suddenly you're elected to one, how useful are you going to be? So they actually went through, and there was a lot of funding thrown into this project to train VDC members on this is what VDCs do. Okay, so that's a clear example of like targeted efforts. We need VDCs to be functioning more effectively. Let's train them on how to do that. Okay. You can also do things like contribute directly to NGOs and civil society actors. So in particular, organizations most likely to get support from a country like the US would be women's rights groups, labor groups, even entrepreneurs can fall into this category of trying to promote this sense of free market as a way of promoting democracy, right? Free market, free enterprise, invention, innovation, entrepreneurial spirit linked into that will be promoting democracy as well. So we'll throw this up here. This is figure 9-3 from the book. This is U.S. democracy aid as a proportion of foreign aid. So if we're looking at all of the aid, 100% of aid would be all of the military, democracy, humanitarian, et cetera, et cetera. This is just taking democracy aid. So you can see, particularly in the 90s when we were dealing with things like the breakdown of Yugoslavia, dealing with the genocides in Burundi and Rwanda, obviously we had a lot more support for democratic aid as we were transitioning out of the Cold War, trying to encourage countries that were coming out of the Cold War in particular to transition to democracy. That has wobbled a little bit through the 2000s, but it remains fairly constant-ish, between 10 and 20% of the US's overall foreign aid budget is democracy specific. Okay. So let's talk about this last one here, humanitarian aid. So this, interestingly, is the one that people are probably most familiar with. You've probably seen the most pictures related to humanitarian aid. You've probably heard about it the most. This is aid given to a country to help mitigate the effects of a disaster or some other type of humanitarian emergency. So it's meant to be a direct response to a specific emergency. So there was a hurricane, there was a traumatic event, there was a state-sponsored violence episode. Okay, so a specific thing. So this is supposed to be very targeted to a specific event. All right. Donor states, when something like this happens, like say there's just absolutely devastating flooding in a country, donor states are meant to decide, okay, this has reached the level of humanitarian crisis. We will coordinate with each other to decide the degree of aid and the strategy for delivery. So something very common that will happen will be something like, the U.S. has a lot of infrastructure in place to be able to actually deliver goods in the time of a humanitarian crisis. We've got big planes, big cargo planes. We've got a lot of forward deployed military that we're able to organize and get everything ready and get it where it needs to go. Whereas a country like France or maybe Sweden doesn't have that ability. So they might do something like provide money to buy the things that go in the plane, but the US uses the planes, right? So we'll all decide, okay, this is what I can give, this is what I can give, let's lump it all together and let's give it to this country, all right? We'll talk about a couple things here that make aid less effective though. So emergency aid, humanitarian aid is going to be less effective if there is active civil conflict going on. So you can imagine in a case of something like South Sudan, if there is active conflict going on at the same time that there's a humanitarian emergency, it can be really difficult for aid actors to get in there, to do what they need to do, to triage situations, to provide the help that's needed. It can often lead to cases where they are forced to flee too. They are forced to be on the move too. The situation is not able to be stabilized enough for them to even go into the areas that need the most assistance. Okay. A corrupt regime can be a challenge here as well. We can probably imagine, because if a regime has any say whatsoever in how the resources get doled out, what do you think they'll do? They'll either scrape off the top or they'll just take it all writ large, right? You'll maybe get a couple of propaganda type pictures of them delivering some of it somewhere, but otherwise they'll probably stockpile it, take it all for themselves, scrape it off the top, do what they want to do with it. That can be a real challenge. Also, interestingly, the severity of the emergency. The more severe and devastating it is, the more people participate in assisting. So even something, you can think of something like the Flint water crisis. How many years has it been that we have had the Flint water crisis? But because it doesn't seem as severe, it's not as shocking to the system as something like people drowning in floods or widespread chaos, or a tornado flattening a city. It doesn't have that same, for better or worse, the shock value is not there. It doesn't look as severe. And this ties into the fourth point here: international media coverage. The more international media coverage an event gets, the more money will be thrown at the issue. Okay, so piecing those together, severity of the emergency, if the international community deems it severe enough and covers it enough, your chances of getting the aid are going to be better. So, I co-authored a paper about this in the case of aid to Mali. So you have a lot of instability in Mali, particularly in the northern regions of Mali. And we did a study. We used World Bank data and found that, yeah, they're not targeting the aid to the people that need it the most. They're targeting it to the people that it's most conveniently easy to access, people that already speak French, so they're able to have quick communication with them, right? So a big challenge is you probably don't even know what's going on in Mali. You're not hearing about it. The severity of the emergency isn't known. There's not international media coverage. So left to their own devices, yeah, there is aid getting into this country, but is it targeting the people that are in most desperate need of it? No, it's not. It's not getting to them, okay? And these are some of the challenges that they're facing is, man, if people just knew how severe this was, if we had some media coverage here, there would be more of a spotlight shined on us, and we could be maybe actually getting the help that we need, okay? So those are the four types of aid. We've got development aid, military aid, democracy aid, humanitarian aid, okay? I'd love for you guys to comment down below with any questions that you have, and otherwise I will see you guys for the next lecture. All right, have a great day.